The Terminal 3 departure lounge at Vancouver International Airport went completely quiet. The moment an airport security officer's hand closed around the upper arm of a black woman sitting calmly in the executive boarding queue, her boarding pass resting face up on her knee. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." The officer's voice carried the particular brand of synthetic authority that people like him had spent years cultivating, loud enough to be heard, quiet enough to maintain deniability. "There's been a flag on your ticket." Security officer Dennis Brandt had worked the International Departures Terminal for 11 years. In that time he had developed what his colleagues privately called his radar, and what a subsequent internal investigation would more accurately describe as a documented pattern of selectively targeting black and brown travelers in the premium boarding zones. Tonight he had spotted Corporal Yvette Oduya-Chambers, tall, composed, wearing a charcoal blazer and pressed slacks, seated 3 rows from the Air Canada signature class gate, and decided she was the flag. He had no idea that the woman whose arm he was gripping had spent the last 14 years serving in the Canadian Armed Forces. He had no idea she had completed 2 tours in Latvia with NATO's enhanced forward presence, or that she had been awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for actions during a humanitarian deployment in Mali that most Canadians would never read about in any newspaper. He had no idea that her commanding officer, Brigadier General Clifton Asare, was standing 30 feet away at the Maple Leaf Lounge entrance, watching the entire interaction unfold over the rim of his coffee cup. Corporal Oduya-Chambers looked at the hand on her arm the way a person looks at a minor inconvenience they have encountered before, many times, and are profoundly tired of. She did not pull away. She did not raise her voice. She looked up at Brandt with a steadiness that had been forged somewhere between the Latvian border and the Malian desert, and she said, quietly and precisely, "Please remove your hand." Brandt did not remove his hand. "Ma'am, your ticket flagged in our system as a potential duplicate booking. It's standard procedure. If you'll just come with me to the secondary screening area." "My ticket did not flag," Yvette said. "I checked in at the kiosk at 16:40. I passed through security at 16:58. I was issued this boarding pass by agent 20 minutes ago." She held the pass up slowly, deliberately, the way someone holds up evidence. "If there is a flag on my booking, the gate agent can verify it here. I do not need to go anywhere." A family at the adjacent seating bank had stopped loading their carry-ons. An older couple near the window had lowered their magazines. 3 people had phones out, held at angles that were not accidental. Brandt felt the familiar heat of an audience, and it did the wrong thing to him. Instead of prompting caution, it activated something uglier. The need to demonstrate that he was the one with the authority, the one who controlled this square of carpet in this terminal, the one whose word defined what was standard and what was a problem. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again. This is a security matter and I am authorized to." "Under what section of the Aeronautics Act?" Yvette said. "Are you authorized to physically detain a ticketed passenger in a departure lounge without evidence of a specific security threat?" She said it without heat, without theater, in the same tone she used when debriefing junior soldiers, factual, precise, completely immovable. "Because I've read it, and you are not." Brandt's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being cited at. The people he usually pulled aside were flustered, apologetic, eager to comply because compliance felt like the fastest way out. This woman was not flustered, she was not apologetic, and the longer she sat there being correct, the larger the audience around them grew. "You're obstructing a security procedure," Brandt said, lowering his voice to what he imagined was a threatening register. "That's a serious offense." "Sitting in a boarding lounge with a valid ticket," Yvette replied, "is not obstruction. I'd like to speak to your supervisor." "I'm the senior officer on this." "Then I'd like to speak to the CATSA duty manager." A second security officer, younger, appeared at Brandt's shoulder. He looked at the phones, he looked at the corporal, he looked at his colleague with the specific expression of someone who has just realized they are watching a situation become a report. Brandt made his decision, the wrong one, the one that men like him almost always make when their ego has been engaged and an exit hasn't been taken, and he said, "You're coming with me," and moved to take her by the arm again. He did not get there. "Dennis." The voice came from behind him. It was not loud, it did not need to be. It had the particular quality of a voice that had spent decades being heard across tarmacs, across briefing rooms, across the controlled chaos of military operations in 3 countries, a voice that was not in the habit of repeating itself. Brigadier General Clifton Asare set his coffee cup down on the nearest surface with the deliberate care of a man ensuring his hands were free. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, wearing a dark civilian overcoat over his service dress uniform. The uniform he had changed into 30 minutes ago in preparation for the regimental function in Ottawa he was flying to attend. The 3 gold maple leaves on his epaulettes caught the terminal lighting in a way that several bystanders would later describe, in their own videos, as impossible to miss. He walked forward until he was standing directly beside Yvette, close enough that Brandt had to look up at him. "My name is Brigadier General Clifton Asare, Canadian Army. This is Corporal Yvette Oduya-Chambers, currently on an authorized travel order issued by my office." He reached into the breast pocket of his overcoat and produced a folded document. He held it out, not urgently, not aggressively, the way a person holds out something that has already ended a conversation before it can continue. Her travel was arranged through the Department of National Defense Liaison Office at YVR. Her booking is confirmed, verified, and has been confirmed twice because I watched her check in. Do you have a specific security concern you'd like to put on record, or shall we proceed to the gate? The silence in the departure lounge was the kind that happens when an entire group of strangers simultaneously understands that they are watching something they will describe to other people for the rest of the week. Brandt's hand had dropped somewhere during the Brigadier General's second sentence. His posture, the wide-legged chest-out stance he had deployed for this entire interaction, had collapsed incrementally, vertebra by vertebra, until he was simply standing in the middle of a busy airport terminal, looking like a man who had just made a significant and very public error. "Sir," Brandt said, there was a flag in the system." "What flag?" The Brigadier General's eyes did not leave him. The system flagged a potential." "Show me the flag." Asare's voice was patient in the particular way that patience becomes dangerous. "Pull up the system on your handheld right now and show me the specific flag that prompted you to physically attempt to remove a sitting passenger from this lounge." Brandt pulled out his device. He scrolled. The color in his face changed. There was no flag. There had never been a flag. The system showed Corporal Oduya-Chambers' booking as confirmed, paid, checked in and cleared, green across every field. I may have received incorrect information from." "You received incorrect information from yourself," Asare said, "because there is no flag. There has not been a flag at any point during this interaction. What there has been is a uniformed security officer approaching a black woman in an executive boarding lounge and attempting to physically remove her without cause in front of witnesses on camera." He glanced at the phones around them with the practiced awareness of a man who understood documentation. "I'd like your name and badge number. I'd also like the contact information for your duty manager and your CATSA regional supervisor." Brandt's second officer had already stepped back. He was speaking quietly into his radio with the urgency of someone trying to get ahead of something. The duty manager, a composed woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been with the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority for 16 years, arrived at the gate in 4 minutes. She took one look at the Brigadier General's epaulettes, one look at Brandt's face, one look at the phone still recording from 3 angles, and closed her eyes for approximately 1 second. "General Asare," she said, "I am deeply sorry. Please tell me what happened." What happened was this. Corporal Yvette Oduya-Chambers boarded her flight to Ottawa 22 minutes later in the first group, as her signature class ticket entitled her to do. She did not raise her voice once during the entire incident. She did not cry. She did not perform distress for the cameras around her, though no one would have blamed her if she had. She picked up her carry-on bag, straightened her blazer, and walked through the gate with the measured calm of someone who had learned, a long time ago and in much harder circumstances, that composure was its own form of power. Brigadier General Asare sat beside her in 2A and 2B. He poured them both water from the bottle the flight attendant brought and said quietly, "You handled that better than I would have." "I've had more practice," Yvette said, and she looked out the window at the lights of the airport receding below them, and she did not say anything else about it because there was nothing left to say about it on that flight. The other part, the part that Brandt had not yet begun to understand was coming, that would happen on the ground. Sandra Okafor did not go home after her shift. She sat in the security office at YVR and she pulled Dennis Brandt's incident reports for the previous 4 years. What she found was not surprising. What it was a pattern so clear and so consistent that it had the quality of a document someone had been building against him without knowing they were building it. 11 complaints in 4 years. 9 of the 11 involved Black or South Asian travelers in premium zone. 7 had been closed with no action. 2 had resulted in what the records described as verbal counseling. a phrase that in this context meant a conversation that changed nothing. She picked up the phone and called the CATSA regional director at home. She apologized for the hour. She told him she had a situation. She used the words Brigadier General, documented pattern, and currently being recorded by multiple passengers. The regional director told her he would be in the office at 06. He arrived at 05:47. The formal review process began on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the Department of National Defence had submitted a written account of the incident through official channels to Transport Canada. The account was signed by Brigadier General Asare and contained 17 paragraphs of precise, unemotional, legally structured description of what had occurred in Terminal 3. It also contained an appendix, a copy of Corporal Oduya-Chambers' service record, 14 years, 2 international deployments, the Meritorious Service Medal. A commendation from the NATO commanding officer in Adaji that used the phrase exceptional composure under sustained pressure, a phrase that, reading it in the context of the incident at YVR, landed with a particular weight. Brandt arrived at the review hearing in the same ill-fitting sport coat he wore to every official function, carrying the confidence of a man who had survived 11 complaints and believed that the process existed to protect him. His union representative, a veteran of dozens of these proceedings, sat beside him with the expression of someone who had read the file and was beginning to understand that this one was different. The CATSA regional director opened the proceedings. He was joined by a representative from Transport Canada's Civil Aviation Security Branch, and at the far end of the table, a woman named Inspector Amara Voss from the Canadian Human Rights Commission, who had flown in from Ottawa that morning, and who had the particular focused stillness of someone who had spent her career in rooms like this one and was not easily impressed by anything she found there. Mr. Brandt, the regional director began, I want to be direct with you about the nature of this proceeding. We are not here to determine whether a mistake was made. The record is clear that a mistake was made. We are here to determine the scope of that mistake and what it reflects about a pattern of conduct that predates this incident significantly. Brandt's union representative leaned in to say something. The regional director raised a hand. Mr. Brandt, you have 11 complaints on file over 4 years. 9 involve passengers of colour in premium travel areas. 7 were administratively closed. They should not have been. That administrative failure is something this organisation will be accounting for separately. He paused. But the reason those complaints are being reopened today, the reason Inspector Voss is in this room, is that on Monday evening you attempted to physically detain a decorated Canadian Armed Forces corporal in a public departure lounge, without cause, in front of a brigadier general who witnessed the entire interaction from the point of your approach. You did this in a terminal covered by security cameras. You did this in front of a minimum of 6 members of the public who were recording on their personal devices. And when asked directly to produce evidence of the flag you claimed had triggered your attention, you could not produce it because it did not exist. Brandt opened his mouth. The flag did not exist, the regional director repeated, with the finality of someone closing a door. We have pulled the full system log. There was no flag. There was never a flag. Which means the only thing that flagged Corporal Oduya-Chambers' presence in that lounge was your own judgment. And your judgment, Mr. Brandt, is exactly what is under review. Inspector Voss spoke then, for the first time, in the particular quiet voice of someone who does not need volume to command a room. Mr. Brandt, the Canadian Human Rights Commission has accepted a formal complaint filed by Corporal Oduya-Chambers. In reviewing this complaint, we have also accepted the 11 prior complaints as contextual documentation of systemic conduct. This is no longer a workplace performance matter. This is a human rights investigation. I want you to understand what that means procedurally and practically before we proceed. Brandt's union representative was no longer leaning in to offer counsel. He was staring at the table. What it meant, procedurally and practically, was this. Dennis Brandt was suspended without pay pending the outcome of the CATSA review and the Human Rights Commission investigation. His security clearance was revoked. His access to any federal transport facility was suspended. The 7 administratively closed complaints against him were reopened and formally logged. 3 of the individuals involved in those complaints were contacted by the Commission and invited to submit updated statements. 2 of them did. The CATSA review concluded in 6 weeks. Its findings were released publicly, as all CATSA findings are, with Brandt's name redacted but the pattern intact. A pattern that transport journalists picked up within 48 hours and that resulted in a Globe and Mail piece with the headline, "A decorated soldier, a baseless stop, and a decade of complaints that went nowhere." The piece did not name Corporal Oduya-Chambers at her request. It named Dennis Brandt, because by then the Human Rights Tribunal had, and the information was part of the public record. Brandt did not return to work. His employment with CAT-SA was terminated at the conclusion of the internal review. The union filed a grievance. The grievance went to arbitration. The arbitrator reviewed the documented pattern, the absence of any flagging event in the system logs, the Brigadier General's written account, the security camera footage, the multiple witness statements, and the Commission's preliminary findings, and dismissed the grievance in 4 paragraphs. The Human Rights Tribunal hearing took place 7 months after the incident. Brandt sat at the respondent's table, looking nothing like the man who had puffed his chest in Terminal 3. He was thinner. He had the specific hollowness of someone who has spent months learning what it means when institutional protection is withdrawn. When the colleagues who nodded along in the break room suddenly don't return your calls. When the procedures you counted on to absorb your consequences have turned around and become the mechanism of those consequences instead. Corporal Yvette Oduya-Chambers sat in the gallery in her service dress uniform. She had requested, through her legal representative, that the proceedings not be made into a spectacle. She answered the questions she was asked with the same precision she brought to everything else. She described the hand on her arm. She described the non-existent flag. She described being asked to cite the Aeronautics Act in a departure lounge to a man who was supposed to be enforcing it. She described, when asked how many times she had been through before, not in a war zone, not in a foreign country, not in a briefing room with hostile parties on the other side of the table. Here, at home, in Canada, in airports and hotels and parking structures and building lobbies and every other ordinary place that became, without warning, a place where someone decided she needed to account for her presence. The tribunal found in her favor on all counts. Brandt was ordered to pay compensation. The quantum was not large by some measures, but the finding was public, permanent, and attached to his name in the way that such findings are: findable, citable, undeniable. The CAT-SA regional office was directed to implement mandatory systemic review training across all terminals with specific protocols for premium zone interactions. 3 supervisors who had signed off on the closed complaints without investigation were required to undergo remedial review. The Brigadier General did not attend the tribunal. He had a deployment schedule, he submitted his written account, and that was the last formal thing he did in connection with the case, because the account was sufficient and because he understood, as Yvette did, that the goal was never theatre. The goal was the finding, the goal was the record, the goal was the next person who sat in a departure lounge with a valid ticket and a service record and a right to be exactly where they were. On the morning the tribunal decision was released, Corporal Oduya-Chambers was on a tarmac in Kingston, Ontario, running a pre-deployment equipment check with her unit. She read the notification on her phone during a break, standing beside a light armoured vehicle in the January cold, and she felt something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. The particular quiet that arrives when a thing you have been carrying gets set down, not because it was resolved, but because it was finally, formally, seen. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to the equipment check. There was work to do. This is not a story about one bad officer making one bad decision on one unremarkable Monday evening. It is a story about what happens when a person who has spent a decade operating without consequence encounters someone who is, for the first time, impossible to dismiss. Not because of rank, not because a general happened to be nearby, but because the evidence was finally undeniable and the room was finally paying attention. The rank mattered because it got the door open. What mattered after that was the record, the pattern, the 11 complaints, and the 7 that should never have been closed. True authority doesn't announce itself in a departure lounge. It waits, it documents, it boards the flight, and eventually, not fast enough, never fast enough, but eventually, it balances the scale. If this story of composure, accountability, and the long arc of justice moved you, hit that like button right now and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Sounds of Justice and turn on the notification bell, because the stories that don't make the front page are exactly the ones that most deserve to be told. I keep thinking about the moment Yvette asked him which section of the Aeronautics Act gave him the right to do what he was doing. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, that's the thing, but because of how quiet it was. She didn't reach for anger, she reached for the law. She reached for the exact fact that dismantled his position, and she delivered it in the same tone you'd use to ask someone to pass the salt. That's not something you can fake. That kind of steadiness comes from somewhere real, from years of choosing precision over reaction, from understanding that the loudest person in a confrontation is rarely the most powerful one. Yvette knew the law better than the man trying to use it against her. And she knew it because she had prepared for exactly this kind of moment. Not that evening specifically, but in the general sense that people who have been targeted their whole lives often prepare, quietly and thoroughly, for the world as it actually is, rather than the world as it should be. What strikes me most is the integrity it takes to stay composed when every instinct is telling you that what's happening is wrong. Most of us, faced with a hand on our arm and a false accusation in a public space, would feel the floor drop out. We'd get loud, or we'd get small. Yvette did neither. She stayed exactly where she was, exactly who she was, and she made the truth available to anyone paying attention. That's a kind of moral courage I find genuinely hard to name. It's not heroism in the cinematic sense. It's something quieter and I think harder. The discipline to trust that being right matters, even when the person across from you is acting like it doesn't. And then there's what happened after. 11 complaints, 7 closed without action. A pattern that should have been visible to anyone who looked, and for years, nobody looked. It took one incident that couldn't be explained away, one room full of witnesses, one general with epaulets that caught the light, one system log with no flag in it, for the whole structure to become undeniable. I don't say that to diminish what Yvette did. I say it because I think it matters to name the intelligence it took to document everything, to know her rights, to give the process what it needed to work. She didn't just endure that evening in Terminal 3. She gave the truth nowhere to hide. Brandt thought the badge was the whole of the story. He thought authority was the same thing as accountability, and that a pattern of behavior could be indefinitely absorbed by a system that had absorbed it before. He was wrong, and the reason he was wrong wasn't luck. It was that the person he chose to target that evening had spent 14 years building the kind of record that outlasts any single moment of injustice. The scales don't balance by accident. They balance because someone had the integrity to tell the truth, the clarity of mind to say it precisely, and the resolve to keep standing there until the room caught up. I think about Yvette reading that tribunal notification on a tarmac in Kingston in January beside a light armored vehicle and then putting her phone away and going back to work. That detail stays with me. There was no speech, no moment for the cameras. Just a decision made and a case closed and a soldier back to the job she had always been doing. That to me is the whole story.